Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. Yes, it is a live show, and you might have said, why weren't you live the last couple of days? Well, it's theoretically possible we could have done that, but sometimes there are difficulties created not so much by the snow, although that certainly has been a problem, but by the blackouts and the rolling blackouts, because in order to do this, our engineer, who would probably be doing it remotely, might, in the middle of that, lose power. We might have lost power, but again, probably not, but it was better to be safe. And so today is a live program. Tomorrow is a live program. We're going to have Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us on our weekend edition. So we really have a lot to cover. But if you've been waiting for this program so that you can maybe express your sense of concern, frustration, anger, I really want to give you that opportunity today, because as I have mentioned before, most of the people that listen to this hour, most of the stations are Texas, but even if they're in other parts of the country, you certainly have been affected by what many people have called snowmageddon, and so there are all sorts of things we can be talking about. Also, of course, I do want to get into some of these issues of why did this take place, and I won't claim to be an expert, but I can quote some experts. Tomorrow we'll have Dr. Merrill Matthews in there, and I think he pretty much qualifies as an expert, individual that has done a fairly significant amount of energy research over the years and has testified in front of Congress, so we'll get his perspective on that as well. Tomorrow, of course, we'll also maybe get into a little more detail in some of the other things that I'm planning on covering today, not the least of which is, of course, the death of Rush Limbaugh, and I want to give some perspective to that a little bit later. So we have a lot to cover today, and we'll do so. But just as a program note, let me mention that an hour from now, we'll have Mike Gonzalez on. He has written a very good piece, which really helps us understand why we're hearing this idea of equity versus equality. And he makes a distinction, and it's a distinction being made by President Joe Biden. So we really want to get into that for a little bit. Then we'll get into some of the other details of the conversation that we have. And I've posted a number of articles that I think you want to read. 2 hours from now, Chuck Bentley will be with us. He has a book which we mentioned last time he was on the program called 7 Gray Swans, really looking at 7 real concerns in the economic realm, and we should have those. And I have a printed version of it, but you will be able to get a Kindle version of it, and I would highly recommend that you spend some time reading through that and understanding some of the circumstances that are unfolding. Well, how do we try to explain what is happening with the Texas grid? First of all, let's recognize this comes from some people that are very critical of the way in which this has been handled in the past. And there's going to be a lot of finger pointing going around. We've already seen that those who are in power, that would be Governor Greg Abbott, saying, well, this maybe is we need an investigation into ERCOT. Okay, well, we certainly do. But the bottom line is what, Mr. Governor, have you been doing about this? What has the legislature been doing about this? There are those calling for very significant investigations. There are many people criticizing the governor, saying that it is quite likely that this, along with COVID, might cause him to not win re-election. Of course, I have no inside track at the moment as to whether or not he's running for re-election, but if he is, could he be replaced by, I don't know, a Governor Beto O'Rourke? Governor Matthew McConaughey. You're all laughing, I know. Don't laugh. We have had Jesse Ventura as governor. We have had former actors like Ronald Reagan as governor. I mean, so, we've had a person who's never been in politics, Donald Trump, who was a president for 4 years. So don't doubt me on the possibility of some of that. But nevertheless, that is another issue. And now you're starting to have some of the national media criticizing the governor, and everybody's criticizing ERCOT and all the rest. So the interesting comment, in case you want to keep track of this from a money point of view, is as best as we can estimate, Texas taxpayers, you and me, if you're in the state of Texas, we have subsidized this green energy industry at the tune of $19 billion. And this has come primarily under two Republican governors, two Republican lieutenant governors, and nearly 20 years of Republican-run legislatures. So do you think the Democrats are going to do something with that in the next election? Yes, the answer to that is obviously. And so that will be one of those issues that we'll come back to. Very good piece that came out just the other day by the Texas Public Policy Council. And I thought they maybe give us an idea of the complexity here. But let's take the simple one first. And that is ERCOT, which is, if you will, the grid operator, has actually, in some respects, overestimated its ability to maintain a grid, a reliable energy grid, without a sufficient what's called supply buffer or reserve margin. You know that there is a certain number, you've probably seen it on television the last couple of days, a graph for demand, and hopefully supply is above the graph for demand. And when the demand is above the supply, well, you know what happens, what has been happening the last couple of days. So that margin, first of all, has been one that has been a little healthier in the past, but the margin has basically been shrinking because we have, in this state and in other places, but I'll use Texas as an example, and if you're in a different state listening right now, you can make the application to yours, have moved from what most people would consider to be reliable sources of energy. That's coal, that's gas, natural gas, all those kinds of things. Okay. And so as a result, that has made, if anything, the grid more weather dependent. And of course, we've all seen the pictures of frozen wind turbines, which probably wouldn't have been generating a lot of wind power anyway during the winter, but would have provided some. So that's the first issue. Now, it's a little more complex than that, so I'm going to start with some complexity, and then we'll take it after the break. Because what do you do when your wind and solar production, for example, during the winter drops down? Well, then you have a system in which it trips on various gas and coal-powered plants. And you can kind of think about this. If you've lived in a home where all of a sudden the lights go out, and it isn't because of a blackout, and somebody plugged in too many toasters or heaters or something like that, and you trip a what? Well, a circuit breaker, then that trips it off. Well, there's a simpler kind of system which trips it on. And so the argument is very quickly made that why didn't those come online? Well, the harsh reality, and I'll talk about this after the break, is that many of these ones that are offline don't come online real quickly. There are all sorts of reasons why they don't. First of all, they're not necessarily always made to do that. Number two, we had all sorts of problems with the freezing of lines and a variety of other things. So we'll come back and talk about that. Some of those smaller, what are called quick start plants, get online pretty quickly. Others don't. And when you have a frozen gas line, or when you have equipment that is frozen, you just can't trip it to go on. So we'll talk about more of that in just a minute, and then talk about all the finger pointing that will take place, because we've got a lot of it, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Numerous surveys show that socialism is often more popular among young people than capitalism. That's why I've written numerous commentaries and booklets on the subject. My booklet on a biblical view on capitalism and socialism explains the two views and answers many of the criticisms socialists have about the free enterprise system. My booklet on a biblical view on socialism helps to answer many of the arguments used to promote socialism. The latest post-election survey done by the Cultural Research Center shows a significant decline in support for socialism. George Barna believes that another reason for this decline is the aggressive marketing of a government-driven culture that show young and old what socialism in America would really be like. He found that the most precipitous decline in support for socialism was among Americans aged 30 to 49. Just a decade ago, they were the demographic I often pointed to as those who supported socialism more than capitalism. That has changed significantly. Socialism is less popular even for Americans who are age 50 years or older. In the past, they have been the group most consistent in their support of capitalism. But even in this group, there is an 8 percentage point drop in support for socialism. The demographic groups with the least support for socialism were Christians who had a biblical worldview and what George Barna calls sage cons. That would be spiritually active, governance-engaged conservative Christians. But there's still a small percentage of them who support socialism. That is why I have a section in my booklets on whether the Bible teaches socialism. You know, support for socialism is declining, and that is good news. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me say that if you would like to join the conversation today, maybe you would like to vent a little bit and maybe be angry, maybe say these are some investigations that need to be taking place, like to just express your experience, we would love to hear from you today. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some phone calls and maybe get your thoughts about how long your house or your business was without power. Some of you have set absolutely unbelievable records of living in the cold. Maybe some of you have had your house flooded, and if you'd like to share some of that, we'd love to hear it. So again, 1-800-351-1212. As you may know, not only do we broadcast a radio program, but we also have cameras in the studio. And already we've had some comments from people saying, Kerby, you're dressed a little different. And if there's one thing I learned from Marlon Maddox, you dress for radio, especially now that we have cameras. But there's a reason why I'm dressed a little bit like this. I wasn't sure how cold it was going to be in the studio. And there have been some times when it's been really hot in the studio, not too many times when it's been cold in this studio, but in others where you maybe don't see your breath, but it's a little cooler. So we'll be back to a full dress tomorrow, but for those of you who want to have a little bit of fun at my expense, you can go and look online and see I'm wearing a turtleneck and look a little bit more like a casual person today, although I think it's still pretty dressy. And if you're wondering, what are we going to do? Our engineer here, Doug, he's actually going to spend the night here. He's going to sleep in my office. There's a nice couch there and got all the things he needs. So this is the kind of thing we do in order to make these broadcasts available to you. View. Let's go back to Texas outage, and if you'd like to join us, I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Jesse Isaac, Brent Bennett, and Katie, a number of other people that have written this article that I'm quoting from say, when you are dealing with the grid, then there's always a situation when wind and solar production, they say, predictably drops during a winter storm, and the buffer that exists collapses. At that point, then you need some of those gas and coal-fired plants to trip on. And that's, like I said, sort of like a circuit breaker. When the system trip won't last long, that's fine because those are just sort of stopgap measures. But when you've had them needing to be on for such long periods of time, that is a different problem. So the argument that I'm reading from right now says that when people blame ERCOT for not acting quickly, well, they're right. There are some things that could have been done, and I think some of that gets back to the decision in the legislature. Why try to actually protect all sorts of plants from devastating weather that comes at most once a decade? I think there's a very good argument for that because we've talked about the need to protect the Texas grid from all sorts of other things like an explosion of a nuclear bomb in the upper atmosphere that would actually ruin all of the energy production facilities or even a natural phenomenon. And we've done whole programs on that here on Point of View, but nevertheless, that is the case. So then if you want to get into the technicalities, as they point out, the race to add in renewable sources of energy, what it tended to do is push out reliable forms of energy. And so as a result, that was the case. So the buffer in our electric system, they said, went from about 20% surplus just a few years ago to surplus in the single digits. So you can begin to see already this push towards renewables, as good or bad as it might be, certainly have pushed out the reliable sources that would have been able to handle this onslaught of cold. Now, he points out in this particular article that without the buffer, our system has become more vulnerable to outages when we have either extreme heat or extreme cold. The problem is made worse, he says, by the fact that renewables have grown to a more significant percentage of our fleet, making our power grid much more susceptible, as I mentioned just a minute ago, to weather-related shortages. So when you start looking at wind and solar, if you want to point your finger at that, here again are some of the numbers. From about Sunday night, that would be, Valentine's Day, through Wednesday. Usually we get about 32,000 megawatts from wind capacity. And it was delivering less than 10% of that, and for a few hours down to 3%. Well, if you can take 32,000 megawatts and drop them down to 3,000 or less than 1,000 megawatts, right off the bat, you can see that some people are not going to have their homes heated. But if you want to completely blame renewables, and as much as I like Tucker Carlson the other night, I think he did erroneously because this is due in part to the renewables, but it's also due to the fact that we should have been able to trip on what are called natural gas producers. And the best estimates, again, are, maybe this is more technical than you want to know, is that in this particular case, you have these natural gas producers primarily in the Permian Basin, and they were unable to continue to provide enough energy for the grid. And there are a lot of reasons why. First of all, as I pointed out, tripping them on isn't something that happens quickly, except for some of these smaller, what are called quick start plants. Now, you can, again, if you want to start pointing fingers at ERCOT and say, well, they should have gotten ready for these a long time ago, maybe. But there were some other things that happened to those that were trying to get online, and that ranges from frozen gas lines. It's kind of hard to burn natural gas when the gas lines freeze, or interrupted gas service to the lines or equipment. In some cases, you're not getting various trucks and things like that. And so all of those are situations that have created what we have. And he mentions one final thought. Power plants that use gas, coal, and nuclear energy have proven to be extremely high in their reliability and availability, usually over 99%, even during peak conditions. Although extreme cold is sometimes a challenge for some of those are what most of us would actually say are the reliable sources of energy in the state of Texas. And as I hope you've now heard me say, some of those reliable sources were sort of pushed out for the more renewable sources. And tomorrow, especially when we have Dr. Merrill Matthews, I want to talk about, did we learn a lesson about this? Because in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about this new book by Bill Gates and the new initiative by President Joe Biden that are asking for more and more wind and solar power generation. But how well do you think these frozen wind turbines in Texas right now will do? Let's take some of the places where we broadcast at the national hour. That would be like Maine, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. I've just been more recently when I was in upstate New York, I saw how things freeze up very quickly up there. And you have to once again say, maybe it works well in the South when we don't have these weather-related shutdowns, but otherwise we've got some real problems. Okay, let's get to some of the finger pointing, and then we'll take a break. Representative Roger Williams, representative from the state of Texas, over there kind of in the Fort Worth area, said the blackouts caused by this extreme weather reinforces the need to maintain energy independence and increase Texas oil and gas production, not less. Senator John Cornyn, he didn't go to Cancun, did he? I think Ted Cruz did. But anyway, John Cornyn was raising a question about the Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, who actually has been on record of being against fracking and all sorts of energy development. And so he asked the question, what are her plans for rolling blackouts during a cold winter? And then, of course, let's give Greg Abbott his due, because he has been speaking out about some of these concerns. And he says this shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America. Our wind and solar got shut down, and they were collectively more than 10% of our power grid. And that thrust Texas into a situation where it was lacking power on a statewide basis. Critics of him, this comes from the Texas Democratic Party, criticized Governor Abbott. Abbott played politics with the alternative sources of energy, and now thermal sources have been knocked offline. If Abbott cared more about doing his job than trying to scare oil and gas workers into voting for him, Texas should have been able to avoid this crisis. There'll be a lot of finger pointing, but I wanted you to understand some of the background there, because after all, there's going to be an investigation of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas called ERCOT. And it's quite possible that some of those individuals might lose their job. But the reality is that this has been a crisis, if you will, taking place over a long period of time that surfaced this week, and you paid the price for it. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Heck, once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. This half hour, let me spend a little bit of time just making a few other comments about the issue of energy. And if you'd like to join us, maybe you've had an outage and like to share what you've been through. Maybe you have some real concerns and want to have the legislature begin to investigate that. And I've seen some very good pieces that have come out already by Representative Jeff Leach, who's been on this program with us, wanting to have a full investigation. And, of course, you've heard everybody from the governor, the lieutenant governor, all the way down doing that. So I want to talk about that just for another few minutes, just real quickly, just to give you a few other context of statements being made about that. Then I'm just going to mention this, but we're going to get into it more tomorrow. And that is, while we're talking about some of the criticism that is going to come against, likely, Governor Greg Abbott, what about the criticism of Governor Andrew Cuomo? And that is something that I really wanted to have Dr. Merrill Matthews weigh in on, because he was one of the first to have actually investigated how it was that the state of New York actually put people that were COVID-19 positive in nursing homes. But the scandal, which is enough right there, because it was supposed to be we can't discriminate against people that have tested positive. What? I mean, that was insane enough. But now the evidence is coming out that they have lied about this. And this comes, interestingly enough, from Melissa DeRosa. Now, Melissa DeRosa, who was one of his top aides, apologized a few days ago. So this is kind of an ongoing story for withholding the state's nursing home death toll, and told him that they did so because they froze out of fear that the true numbers would be used against them. You think? And I love this because she says, really, we need just a little of appreciation of the context. The idea that, after all, when this first came out, especially in August, the president at that time, Donald Trump, remember him? Yes. Was actually being critical of what was happening in New Jersey with the governor, Phil Murphy. Some of the things that were happening with the governor in California, that would be Gavin Newsom, and even some of the concerns about what was being done by the governor of Michigan, that's Gretchen Whitmer. But most importantly, they were fearful that they would then be attacked. And, of course, the mainstream media, especially the New York media, has been protecting Andrew Cuomo up until now. But now the evidence is very clear that they were not going to give to the Justice Department accurate figures. And, of course, the whole argument is you've got to understand the context. We were being criticized by the president. Well, you think of some other governors that would say, gee, I wish I had the press covering for me. You can think of the governor, for example, of Florida, DeSantis, who's probably saying, I've been pilloried in the press, even though our numbers for deaths and various kinds of infections have been less than New York, but they have come after me time and time again while they've been protecting Governor Andrew Cuomo. You can also, if you want to change it to the conversation we just had, imagine if it came out a few days from now that, say, Governor Greg Abbott was fudging on the numbers of the number of homes that had outages, which is much less than fudging on the number of people that have died in nursing homes. But okay, let's try to say that it was close to an apples-to-apples comparison. The hue and cry that would come out would be horrendous. Or ERCOT was lying about some of their figures and numbers and their production capabilities and all of this. And so it is amazing to me that when you live in a blue state like New York, where you have virtually all the New York media, with the exception maybe of Fox News, in your pocket, you can get away with those kind of arguments. Nevertheless, we were having conversations off air as to whether or not Andrew Cuomo was going to keep his job. But since there's sort of an inside track on some of that Dr. Merrill Matthews can help us with, we will certainly suspend some of the conversation till tomorrow. While we're talking about these power outages, I did, of course, quote from Governor Abbott and some of the criticism from the Texas Democrats. Another representative, Dan Crenshaw, has said West Texas, where most of the wind energy is focused, had wind turbines that had to be de-iced. Isn't that kind of interesting? You have to use helicopters using fossil fuel to drop ice de-icing mixtures, which come from fossil fuel, on wind turbines that were produced by fossil fuel. But nevertheless, okay, I love that one. And so he says, little energy that power regulators planned on wind to supply was now gone. This is what happens when you force the grid to rely in part on wind as a power source. When weather conditions get bad, as they did this week, intermittent renewable energy like wind isn't there when you need it. And again, Representative Dan Crenshaw's point there as well. Since I did mention Tucker Carlson, I don't want to look like I'm beating up on him, so here's the exact quote that he used, and generally it's true, but it got the commentary went too far, because Tucker Carlson the other night talked about this, and he said, according to the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, that's ERCOT, which manages 90% of the state's electricity, in 2020, wind provided 22.8% of the energy use in Texas, with natural gas producing 45.5%, coal providing 17.9%, nuclear providing 10.9%. ERCOT labels the other 2% of energy sources as others. And so the point he made is when he gave the numbers, those were correct. But then later when he said they over-relied on wind, no, but they did rely on wind. So I would change the modifier, the adjective, and that's why he was criticized a little bit on that particular issue. But to be fair, let's give you a quote from the Energy Institute at Southern Methodist University. Bruce Bullock said, the wind turbines are not to blame solely. That's true. About half of them did ice up and they weren't able to be used. But we don't plan, he says, on wind energy in the winter down here because wind doesn't blow that much. So, again, to blame all of it on renewables, no. Was renewables a big part of it? Yes, because it's back to that margin we talked about just a minute ago. And again, if you want to look at some of the other issues, about 18 gigawatts that were missing came from renewable resources like wind, but about 28, and I'm talking about 28 gigawatts, were from thermal sources like natural gas, nuclear energy, and coal. So again, you can't blame everything on renewables or on wind and solar, but did it narrow the gap and make it more likely? Yes. So yeah, you can take that either direction. And I'm trying to be fair at a time when all the politicians, all the angry consumers, all the people who have been through outages are going to be pointing a lot of fingers, and they're welcome to do so, but just wanted to give you a couple of facts real quickly. This is something I'll spend more time talking about in the National Hour, but all of this happens at a time when Bill Gates has his new book coming out. Bill Gates' book, if you haven't picked one up, and if Barnes & Noble were open today, I'd go get my copy because I've already been reading about it. How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And what started this was an interview that was on 60 Minutes. And Dave Hersani actually put some of that up there. Did we post that one today? We did the other day, but I'll post it again maybe tomorrow because it will relate to some of the conversation we'll have with Dr. Merrill Matthews. But he does point out, David Hersani talks about the fact that on Sunday on 60 Minutes, Bill Gates worth $133 billion and Anderson Cooper worth $110 million got together in 60 Minutes to talk about all the sacrifices we're going to have to make to avert an imminent climate catastrophe, because the goal in the book is to reduce carbon emissions to completely to zero in 30 years by 2050. Not 40%, not 30%, not 10%, not 5%, zero. We use 20 million barrels of petroleum every day in this country. To get that down to zero is going to require just an incredible amount of work, which doesn't seem like it's going to take place. And to his credit, and I hope he says it in the book because he did say it in the interview, you know, he does live in a 66,000 square foot home. He does own a private jet company, which I'm sure are not going to fly on solar and wind. Could be wrong on that. And so in some respects, you know, he's not the best person in the world to be lecturing the rest of us on how to reduce our carbon footprint. That being true, and that being the case, let me, at least as I've been able to read about the book, say that he's got some good ideas there. One is carbon capture. Another is the idea of thermal storage, the idea of figuring out some way to use cheap hydrogen, which doesn't blow up in our faces, which is a big issue. And he's even talked, which is amazing for a lot of environmentalists, about the next generation of nuclear plants. But nevertheless, there is a lot in here that would cause most of us to say, you are assuming that in the next 30 years, we can bring 20 million barrels of petroleum down to zero. Of course, that doesn't even count coal. It's just not going to happen. Anyway, let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If not, sit back, because I want to talk about Rush Limbaugh for just a minute, and maybe we'll get into that more in the next hour, or certainly tomorrow. I know that there is, again, some opportunities for Dr. Merrill Matthews to share some stories, in part because he wanted to share how there were various attempts to try to push him off the air, that is Rush Limbaugh, or to compete with him. One one of those is Jim Hightower, who was actually raised to try to actually have a national radio show that would compete with Rush Limbaugh. And Dr. Merrill Matthews has some background for that as well. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. By the way, at the top of the hour, we're going to have Mike Gonzalez with us, President Biden's quest for racial equality. But as I talk about Rush Limbaugh, there's a very good piece that we've posted here, Rush, Voice Like No Other. It was one of those that is on our website that you might want to find and to read into your a little bit later if you have some thoughts about that. And most importantly, let me just mention that while we talk about these issues, there is a lot of parallel of Rush Limbaugh's career to Point of View. You know, we've always jokingly said that Marlon Maddox was such a pioneer in radio long before there was a Rush Limbaugh, long before there was a Sean Hannity, there was Marlon Maddox and Point of View. Point of View, if you're not familiar, started almost 50 years ago, and I always knew that Rush Limbaugh started his program in 1988. Actually, I started being a guest host on this program in 1986. So I sort of followed some of that, but I dug this out, that Rush Limbaugh, the first time he tried to do radio was back in 1971. So while Marlon Maddox was thinking about doing a local show, which today we, of course, have as a national show called Point of View, Rush Limbaugh was actually a disc jockey at an AM station in one of the suburbs around Pittsburgh. But very quickly he ran afoul of the fairness doctrine because he was making such, in many cases, even then, outlandish statements. And so as a result, the fairness doctrine really tended to kind of clamp down on opinions. But when the fairness doctrine really sort of went out of favor in the 1980s and was completely repealed in 1987, then Rush Limbaugh went from being a host in Sacramento to actually going to WABC radio in New York. Now, if you want to count his time in Sacramento, then actually the first time I started doing radio on Point of View was about the same time he did. First time he did national, of course, was there in New York. And by 1993, you know, he was on the cover of National Review. He was being seen as, if you will, kind of the boogeyman. He was blamed later on for some of the actions that were taken and those kinds of things. And so there was a desire as his currency began to rise, and because of that, because there were other conservative talk show hosts that were starting to do well, there was a real desire for people that were liberal and progressives to try to come up with an alternative. And I thought it was kind of interesting because one of those, which we'll talk about tomorrow with Dr. Merrill Matthews, is Jim Hightower, who was the Texas Agricultural Commissioner, gave it a shot at a national show, and that didn't work. Then they tried Mario Cuomo. We were just talking about Andrew Cuomo a minute ago. Mario Cuomo would be the father of Chris Cuomo and Andrew Cuomo, and he was the former governor of New York, who was a really great speaker. I mean, one of the best orators of the Democratic Party. And when you put him with, of course, some others that were pretty good, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and others, you have to say he was very good. But again, a great speaker, not a very good talk show host, or at least the talk show didn't do well. So by 21st century, then you had some other attempts, and probably the only other one that is worth noting is back in March of 2004. Air America began, and the network had Al Franken as the individual to be the star. He had published a book, Rush Limbaugh's a Big Fat Idiot. Al Franken, unfortunately, didn't do very well in the talk show host business, but unfortunately for a while actually did pretty well in the United States Senate. But nevertheless, you think about the staying power of Rush Limbaugh over 30 years, and I thought it would be worth comparing the power and the influence of Point of View over almost 50 years, and it's something to think about as well. But Jim Garrity reminds us of the phrase that in Latin is, De mortis nihilum nisi bonum, with apologies for those of you whose Latin is better than mine. Of the dead, say nothing but good. We've always had the idea that if you can't say something good about somebody when they've died, don't say anything. But, of course, as you have probably noticed, with people like Rush Limbaugh, there were a desire for so many people that call themselves liberals and progressives to find anything they can do to be critical. And so you have, can I even say most of these on the air? Okay, racist as hell, misogynistic, lying scumbag. I've got a long list here. After a while, some of the words on Twitter you can't even use, so that's obviously the case. So one person said, after all, there's supposed to be no home for hate here, but Rush Limbaugh's dead. Woo! Today should be a national holiday, and all sorts of people then going after him. But I think that whatever you have thought about Rush Limbaugh, he was an incredible force to reckon with in terms of the influence that he has had. There are some people that have said, after Ronald Reagan, who is the most dominant force in the conservative world, and it wasn't a governor, it wasn't a presidential candidate, and most likely it was a talk show host, Rush Limbaugh. Gary Bauer, our good friend, I'll maybe end with his, points out the fact that by now you've probably heard the heartbreaking news that Rush Limbaugh passed away this morning from the consequences of lung cancer he's been battling. His wife, Catherine, opened his radio show today to make the announcement. He says, I don't need to tell you that Rush was one of a kind. He touched millions of lives and was, in many ways, the heart and soul of American populist conservatism. They say no man is irreplaceable, but he came as close to fitting that definition as possible. He says our condolences go out to wife Catherine, his brother David. By the way, David Limbaugh's been on this program many times before, has actually had seminary background. He's written quite a bit on some of these theological issues, and people have always wondered, where is Rush in terms of his spiritual commitment? And I honestly don't know. Next time I get David on, maybe we'll ask him. But nevertheless, he says, in days ahead, many things will be said and written about Rush Limbaugh. He says, I was honored to speak with him at an event in California a number of years ago. And then, of course, when he talks about when he, in 2000, ran as a presidential candidate, Rush graciously did an interview with him on his show. But he said, if I had to pick one thing that made him so countercultural to the left, and such a vital force, it would be his unapologetic, enthusiastic, heartfelt love for the United States of America, its history, its accomplishments, and its goodness of his people. So if nothing else, did want to mention that briefly today, because if nothing else, it is probably a topic we will get into tomorrow when we have Kelly Shackelford with us, and also when we have Dr. Merrill Matthews. Next hour, we're going to spend some time talking with Mike Gonzalez. And then one of the other articles I've posted here is by Glenn Greenwald, the false and exaggerated claims still being spread about the Capitol riot. It is amazing to me how I find myself more and more quoting from individuals who are left of center, hardly Trump supporters, but nevertheless are trying to call out their fellow liberals and say something has gone wrong here. And so whether it's Alan Dershowitz, or whether it's Glenn Greenwald, whether it's Jonathan Turley, whether it's Jordan Peterson, I mean, you just go down the list of individuals who certainly don't fit as right-wing conservatives, but nevertheless are just appalled by what has happened on the left. And I make a distinction, obviously, as we have before, between those on the left and liberalism. So we'll spend some time looking at just the horror and, if you will, terrible reporting of the Capitol riot. And so we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and it is a live show. Some of you might have said, you know, it sounded like I was listening to some tape shows the last couple of days, and that is true. As you may know, we broadcast from the state of Texas, and we've had some snow, but it wasn't necessarily the snow that's a problem. It was the fact that there were these rolling blackouts, and it made it a little less likely that we might be on the air before something would trip us off. And our engineer, who was going to be doing that, would have to have done it remotely, but I certainly would have been able to come in studio, but we just decided it might be safer to do so. I'm glad Doug is here. Matter of fact, Doug's going to spend the night, and he will be also engineering tomorrow, so we will be able to continue doing live programs, so I hope you'll appreciate that. You're going to find a number of articles we've posted. In just a minute, we're going to be talking with Mike Gonzalez. This a particular piece on Biden's embrace of equality, or the difference between equity and equality. I think you're going to really appreciate some of the material he has there. We then have posted a couple of articles that we will get to later this hour. One, of course, maybe a testimony to the impact of Rush Limbaugh. And, of course, we'll have even more of that tomorrow on our weekend edition. Dr. Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford, I know, are going to want to share some things in that regard. But we have an article, Rush, a voice like no other. The argument that came out from President Biden that we didn't have a vaccine when he took office, which surprises all of us. So we've posted that one. And then one that we're going to do from Glenn Greenwald, the false and exaggerated claims still being spread about the Capitol riot. That will hopefully cover the first hour. Second hour, we're going to be with our friend Chuck Bentley about his book, 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future. So again, we have a lot to cover. And I think, first of all, let's start off with Mike Gonzalez. I've had a chance to watch him on other programs. We have posted this article. First appeared in the New York Post, where I read it, and then now it is available through, of course, the organization he represents, the Heritage Foundation, and he is the senior fellow there at the Center for Foreign Policy, an individual who left journalism to join the administration of President George W. Bush, where he was a speechwriter for Christopher Cox, before moving on to State Department's European Bureau and writing speeches and op-eds. And Mike Gonzalez, it is a delight to have you here on the program with us on Point of View.
Listen, Steve, thank you very much for having me on, and I want to add for your listeners in Texas that my family is praying for you. I will pray for you. I have lived through things like that, and they're not fun. They're quite scary, actually. So God was with you.
Well, I appreciate that. As some of our listeners may know, I'll be in Alaska part of next week, and I'm going up there to get warm. There were days when it was actually warmer in Alaska than it was here in Texas. But so far, we're doing fine, and I want to spend some time, if we can, getting into the difference, because I've tried to explain a little bit by quoting from you that when we hear the word equity, we assume that's the same as equality. But I think you've done a very good job of helping us understand that when President Joe Biden talks about unity, when he talks about equity, he's not talking about the same thing that most of us would assume in our minds. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, no, thank you. And it is amazing that for a man who says he's seeking unity so much, he then uses this corrupted definition of equity. You're quite right that equity, and in the traditional sense, is not that different from equality. You know, it means, you know, the government is going to treat you with justice and fairness. It's going to treat you equally. It's going to treat all Americans equally. That's the American ideal. When we have strayed from that ideal, and we have many times in 240 years of history, we have created problems for ourselves. We have done, really bad things, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. When we have aspired to equality, to the equal treatment of individuals, we have solved our problems, and that is why it is in our birth document, the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, and the 14th Amendment calls for the equal treatment under the law of all Americans. Equity has become the functional opposite of equality, and it's not a definition that Joe Biden came up with. It's a definition that critical race theory has come up with. It's been growing for the last few decades. Kamala Harris, the vice president, makes it very clear that is her definition, that it means that the government is going to distribute resources unequally. But and then here's the thing, Steve, and then I'll get off stage. The thing is, it's not a needs-based treatment, right? I think there's a consensus among Americans that those who have suffered, individuals and families that need help, required a little bit of help from the government. This is just color conscious. This is based on what category you belong to, and these categories can sometimes be a racial category, like black and white. It can be an ethnic categories that are created by government, like Hispanic or Asian American. It can be gender categories, like the 32 supposed gender categories that the New York City Human Rights Commission has created, and it is an equality of outcome based on the category that you belong to that the government seeks. That violates the Constitution, and that is, I think, what your listeners must be very aware of.
Mike Gonzalez with us, and he's with the Heritage Foundation. By the way, I've always supported the Heritage Foundation. Just the other day, I noticed that they had taken some money out of my credit card because I just now routinely support the Heritage Foundation, and I was actually thinking about also supporting Heritage Action, and I certainly encourage you to do the same because of such great work that they do. But one of the things, Mike, I appreciate is that you actually have that direct quote from Kamala Harris. Some people might say, okay, you said that, but I'd like to read it, and that's why we've posted on our website. Matter of fact, we have it linked back to the Heritage article, although you can also find it in the New York Post, because she says equality suggests everyone should get the same amount, but equity is different because people didn't start out with the same amount. And so in some respects, it's sort of a woke definition of equity. And so when you see that term equity show up, 21 times, I think, in this executive order, you can pretty much start understanding that if you don't understand the definition, then you won't necessarily see anything wrong with some of these executive orders. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, and I think it's actually this corrupted definition of equity is done on purpose to confuse Americans. Americans are going to listen to Biden talk about equity, and they're going to say, yeah, that's right, yeah, because to them it means equality. It means the opposite of equality. Folks need to understand that it means the opposite of equality. That executive order you just cited was the first thing that Biden did in office. He signed that executive order his first day, his first hour. In two of the things that it did, by the way, 2 paragraphs, because the executive order was mostly on how all the things that government is going to do in this new program for equity. One thing it did was rescind the 1776 Constitution on history, of which I was a member. I was a member of that commission. And the other thing it did is that it revoked the ban on critical race theory trainings, which are quite racist themselves. And why did it do that? Why did Biden feel so necessary in his first day to do that? That was a requirement of BLM. The BLM organization, Black Lives Matter organizations, had asked for these 2 things to be revoked.
We're going to take a break and get back into some of that. Again, I've written commentaries about the disbanding of the 1776 Commission, so we'll talk about that and much more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Numerous surveys show that socialism is often more popular among young people than capitalism. That's why I've written numerous commentaries and booklets on the subject. My booklet on a biblical view on capitalism and socialism explains the two views and answers many of the criticisms socialists have about the free enterprise system. My booklet on a biblical view on socialism helps to answer many of the arguments used to promote socialism. The latest post-election survey done by the Cultural Research Center shows a significant decline in support for socialism. George Barna believes that another reason for this decline is the aggressive marketing of a government-driven culture that show young and old what socialism in America would really be like. He found that the most precipitous decline in support for socialism was among Americans aged 30 to 49. Just a decade ago, they were the demographic I often pointed to as those who supported socialism more than capitalism. That has changed significantly. Socialism is less popular even for Americans who are age 50 years or older. In the past, they have been the group most consistent in their support of capitalism. But even in this group, there is an 8 percentage point drop in support for socialism. The demographic groups with the least support for socialism were Christians who had a biblical worldview and what George Barna calls sage cons. That would be spiritually active, governance-engaged conservative Christians. But there's still a small percentage of them who support socialism. That is why I have a section in my booklets on whether the Bible teaches socialism. You know, support for socialism is declining, and that is good news. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Mike Gonzalez for a few more minutes. And again, the first article we've posted today on our website, which also links you back to Heritage Foundation. You can find it either way. We've entitled it Equity versus Equality, and just an important issue because in some respects you have to define your terms. How many times have we told you if you're interacting with somebody of a different religion or a different religious cult or group or something like that, define your terms, because sometimes you will not necessarily know what you're talking about. And this, if you will, woke definition of equity is very significant. But Mike, you mentioned something in passing I want to come back to, because I have lamented for the last couple of weeks the loss of the 1776 Commission. We had Dr. Carol Swain on just the other day. She was on that. Victor Davis Hanson was on that. Larry Arnn was heading it up. Michael Ferris. These are all people we've interviewed, and you as well. This was an attempt to, if you will, certainly talk about the founding of this country in 1776, and also really push back against the 1619 project of the New York Times. And one of the first things that this president decided to do was to disband the commission after you were able to issue all of one report. And so I've lamented that because we value history here. Of course, we value truth as well, and that's just a good example of how some of these games are getting played, and most people aren't even aware of them.
Yeah, Kerby, thanks a lot. I mean, sorry I called you Steve earlier. Yeah, that was, by the way, one of the Black Lives Matter organizations. And I want your listeners to understand that I support, of course, the concept that Black Lives Matter is the organizations which are led by Marxists that I find extremely troubling. They called for the revoking of the commission, and they called for the revoking of the ban on critical race theory trainings, which is the reason why I think they were shoehorned into this long executive order on equity. And you're quite right. What we were trying to do was rebalance they not just what the 1619 Project does. And by the way, Black Lives Matter also has a curriculum that is pushing to the nation's 14,000 school districts, and a lot of them are using it. And it goes back. It's an effort that goes back, as you know, to Howard Zinn in 1980 with A People's History of the United States. And these are ways to make Americans, hold the Constitution and the Declaration in their own country in contempt, to make the country look hideous, so people are filled with grievances and bile and want to change the country, want to completely transform the country. So what we wanted to do was give it a balanced view of the United States, not by hiding the problems. The problems are there, and we should examine them. We actually believed that by having an unbiased and objective view of the history of the United States, people would understand why it is this great experiment in liberty and in prosperity. What I just said is not propaganda. That is just factual. 100 million people have immigrated to this country since 1850. This is when my parents decided, I was born in a foreign country, decided to come here to seek liberty. The reason for that, and the reason so many still want to come, is for that reason. That is the product of what the founding fathers created, and they were not flawless. They were men, and you and I have the same understanding that man is flawed, that all earthly creations are going to be imperfect, but within the parameters of that, the United States is very, very good, and we need to go back and retell the story of the country, because what the 1619 Project does, what Howard Zinn does, what Black Lives Matter does, is do the complete opposite, and those are lies.
And again, I think your point is well taken. Sometimes we say, well, history is history. I won't worry about that. But if you start with the idea that there are people that are facing injustice, then you get back to this idea of equity, and we need to do something. And what's that something? Well, yesterday, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties discussed the legislation to actually move forward in paying reparations to African Americans. Now, this has been introduced for some time with people like John Conyers all the way back up to now Sheila Jackson Lee. But this is now much more likely, given the fact that you have a democratically controlled House and Senate and a president that may or may not sign it. Yesterday, of course, you had Larry Elder, who's been on the program with us, testify against it. You had former NFL legend Herschel Walker. But there, again, if you start with the issue of equity, then you talk about things like reparations. You talk about having a different view of civil rights regulations or affirmative action based upon individuals' minority status, and the whole idea of critical race theory and intersectionality. Those are all big words, but the reality is there is a striking difference in this administration between equity and what most of us would assume to be the word equality.
Right, and it all goes back, as you rightly pointed out, to identity politics. As you know, I wrote a whole book on it, The Plot to Change America, which really explains why we're seeing the problems that we're seeing. Identity politics, as I explained in my book, The Plot to Change America, is the reimagining of the country as a confederation of categories. Not a country united of 330 million individuals and their families united in common purposes, but a confederation of categories. These categories, some of them are real, some of them are created by government, like the Hispanic category, created in 1977 by the Office of Management and Budget, also the Asian American category, which really brings together very disparate people, a disparate group of Americans, right? Americans with ancestry in Asia's subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, with people from Japan and Korea and China, then the Philippines, Indonesia, and so forth, very different places that are all grouped together under one category. And then there's all the genders that government creates constantly. So that is what identity politics is. And what it is based on is the idea that some of these groups are marginalized, they are the oppressed, and some are the oppressors, and then government needs to get involved in order to give the members of the marginalized groups greater resources and treat them, give them an equal treatment, a better treatment. That is, all I have to say to that is, just to put it in stark terms, that means that an American neurosurgeon who is a millionaire, who is white, who is of Chilean origin, it's a marginalized person who is in need of greater resources, and a lifelong waitress in Pensacola who is also white and the descendants of generations of Alabama sharecroppers, she must contribute the resources to that neurosurgeon. That on its face, that's all I need to say about how absurd that is.
Yeah, and I've used that before just in terms of those individuals that are allowed to get into a university if they came from a so-called discriminated minority, and they oftentimes were given a benefit than those who maybe came over, their parents were boat people from Vietnam. And so it's just a good illustration of one of the reasons why we've posted this article about equity and equality. But since you mentioned your book, let me give it a shout out there as well. The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. People can get it both in hardback and in Kindle. And it's about 270 pages, if I remember right. And it is a book that came out in July. So it's another resource. So if you wanted to start reading on this, the piece by Mike Gonzalez is very good. We have a link to the website, so you can go to heritage.org and find some of his other articles. If you go into your bookstore, or if you want to find the link that we have here, you could get it in hardback or Kindle, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. Appreciated the good work that you've done. Of course, as you know, I support the Heritage Foundation, and it was a pleasure to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
The pleasure's all mine, and I really want to thank you for your support. From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much.
Again, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the issues in the news. And if I don't get to all of that before the interview we'll do at 2 o'clock or in the next hour with Chuck Bentley, then we will postpone some of that till Friday. But I thought I'd start out very quickly with a piece by Glenn Greenwald. It is amazing to me how I find myself quoting more and more from people that are pretty much left of center, are liberals who would disagree with many of the conversations we have around this table, but they've been calling some of the people that used to be their allies, the left, to be honest. And in Glenn Greenwald's case, he's just talking about how we have poorly, and that's a nice word, in some respects, almost criminally covered the issue of the Capitol riot through the press and have been so inaccurate in some of that. So I wanted you to hear about some of those issues as well. We will get into a couple of the other articles we've posted, including a real surprise to all of us that apparently, according to President Biden, there was no vaccine available when he took office. You mean the one that they were putting in his arm back in December, I guess. I don't know. So we will get into some of those issues and try real quickly to cover a couple of issues in the news that have been taking place over this last week. After all, we're doing a live show today here on Thursday. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Try to give you an overview of what we will cover the rest of today and then certainly tomorrow when we have our weekend edition. And I think one of those that I will mention now and address more tomorrow is the fact that Governor Andrew Cuomo's top aide earlier actually identified the fact that they had been withholding the state's nursing home death toll on COVID-19. Now, the argument she was making is that about the time they were going to release some of that information, it is when President Donald Trump, you might remember him, actually was beginning to criticize what was happening in New York and the actions of Governor Andrew Cuomo, also other governors like the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, or the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, or the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. And so she said, you have to understand and have appreciation for the context because we didn't want to have him use that against us. Well, again, facts are facts, and we will spend some time talking about this tomorrow, in large part because Dr. Merrill Matthews wrote a piece months and months ago about this, in which he had done the investigation on why it was we were actually putting in the state of New York people that were COVID positive in nursing homes, which led to the disaster that we all know. And it had to do, as Dr. Merrill Matthews was able to ferret out and publish, that there was an attempt to say that identifying a person that is COVID positive was discriminatory, and we don't want to discriminate against those individuals. And by not discriminating against those individuals, you have now a scandal that may bring down the governor of New York. And up until now, of course, you've had the New York media pretty much in the pocket of the governor, with the exception maybe of Fox News, but most of the others have been willing to support him. But now you're starting to see a number of Democratic leaders becoming very critical of what is happening there. So we'll see where we go with that story. But I did want to acknowledge that one, and we will cover that more in our Friday discussion. One that illustrates again how the press treats various individuals differently. The other night, doing an interview with CNN's Anderson Cooper, Joe Biden said, it's one thing to have the vaccine, which we didn't have when we came into office. We did also need to have to figure out how to get the vaccine out. And so you've had all sorts of people saying, Mr. President, don't you understand, long before you were the president, long before it had even been certified in the House of Representatives. You might remember that day, January 6th, and you might remember the day of your inauguration, January 20th. We had been vaccinating lots of people. Again, you could say, well, maybe he misspoke, but imagine if it was reversed, and you had an incoming Donald Trump say, well, we didn't even have the vaccine until I came into office. I mean, the press would have gone crazy, and maybe you're not even aware of the fact that Joe Biden had said that, but we've posted that article so you can read the back and forth and all the tweets and things related to that as well. While we're talking about media malfeasance or mischief or maybe even media malpractice, this very long article by Glenn Greenwald is one that I wanted to go through briefly because he talks about what he calls the false and exaggerated claims still being spread about the Capitol riot. I think there's about 24 pages, so I'm going to summarize this very quickly, but I encourage you to read it if you would like to have some of these facts because they're relevant. He said what took place in the Capitol on January 6th was undoubtedly a politically motivated riot. And he goes on to make some statements and said none of this justifies lying about what happened that day, especially by the news media. And he said one of the most significant of these falsehoods was the tale endorsed over and over without any caveats by the media for more than a month that the Capitol police officer Brian Sicknick was murdered by the pro-Trump mob when they beat him to death death with a fire extinguisher. Then he gives you the documentation, which I appreciate because some people might say, well, I'd have to see it for myself. So he's got screenshots of January 8th, an article in the New York Times. Capitol police officer dies from injuries in pro-Trump rampage. Cites some officials there. Then one that comes out later. He dreamed of being a police officer, then was killed by a pro-Trump mob. And it elaborates on the story with some detail. Now, after the publication of those two articles, Glenn Greenwald says this horrifying story about a pro-Trump mob beating a police officer to death with a fire extinguisher was repeated over and over by multiple journalists on television, in print, and in social media. It took such importance because, after all, as he points out, Sicknick's death was the only example the media had of a pro-Trump mob deliberately killing anyone. And then he goes through and talks about some of the others. But he said none of the other 4 deaths were at the hands of protesters. Matter of fact, the only other person killed with deliberate violence was a pro-Trump protester, Ashley Babbitt, unarmed when shot in the neck by a police officer at close range. So he says, as he goes on with some other paragraphs, this is why the fire extinguisher story became so vital to those intent on depicting these events in the most violent and menacing light possible. And then begins to give you some other examples of this, in which he says it's hard, as he said, to overstate how pervasive this fire extinguisher story became. Over and over, major media outlets and mainstream journalists use this story to dramatize what happened. And in each particular case, he provides various Twitter posts and others, interviews, and things of that nature that illustrate that only so well. What's the bottom line? Well, now after going through about 5 pages, I've now tried to summarize the rest. He says the problem with the story is it's false in all respects. From the start, there was no evidence to substantiate it. The only basis were 2 articles in the New York Times, which were based upon the claim of anonymous law enforcement officers, none of who, by the way, can be found. By the way, there are all sorts of people that have said there are more cameras in the Capitol than there are in most casinos. And the fact that we have no picture like that, we have all sorts of people doing selfies and taking pictures with their cell phones. We have nothing of the sort. Should be enough right there. But Glenn Greenwald goes on and says the outlets starting to do the investigation interviewed Sicknick's brother, who said that Sicknick had texted the family Wednesday night to say that while he had been pepper sprayed, he was in good spirits. That obviously conflicted with the Times story that the mob, quote, overpowered Sicknick, struck him in the head with a fire extinguisher, and then with a bloody gash in his head, Mr. Sicknick was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. That's the story that has absolutely no basis in fact there at all. So this continues on now through January into February. To his credit, Glenn Greenwald does give partial credit to a story earlier this month that appeared in CNN, but you had to read deep into the story to finally read this one on a CNN article. In Sicknick's case, it is still not known publicly what caused him to collapse the night of the insurrection. Findings from medical examiner's review have not been released, and authorities have not made any announcements about the ongoing process. According to one law enforcement official, medical examiners did not find that the officer sustained any blunt force trauma, so investigators believe that early reports that he was fatally struck by a fire extinguisher are not true. That wasn't a story earlier this month, but no one really paid attention to it until you get to what's called Revolver News, in which they now analyze the contradictions. And then after that, you had on Fox News, Tucker Carlson spent about 8 minutes examining some of the holes in it there as well. And I think it is very clear that although it is tragic that he died, the story that he was beaten to death by a fire extinguisher is not true. Since I only have a minute before we take our next break, let me take another story that he takes on, because the story that they have of this individual, Eric Munchel, with zip ties, has been used to argue that these were individuals who had planned this ahead of time, that this was a well-coordinated attack to kidnap members of Congress and maybe even put them on some kind of, if you will, trial. And yet the evidence, as he points out there, and I'll just give you the quick bottom line, is that those zip ties actually were on a table in Congress, maybe by some of those individuals thinking they might have to actually arrest some of those protesters, which they did. And so Eric Munchell actually picked them up in part because he did not want them used against the rioters, but he did not come in with those zip ties. And again, there's another great story about this. And Glenn Greenwald says, again, why does all this matter? Well, for the same reason that media outlets so excitedly seized on the claim. If he brought zip ties with him, then that suggests a premeditated plot. But of course, the evidence is to the contrary. Very good piece by Glenn Greenwald. I encourage you to read. It's on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and in the next hour, we're going to be spending some time with Chuck Bentley as we talk about his book, 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future. I actually have a printed version of that, but we've made it available for you to get it in Kindle, and I think it would be something that would help you with your finances. But I've gone long enough, I guess I should acknowledge that I'm getting some comments about the fact that I'm dressed a little differently. Some people saying, you're out of uniform. You know, Marlon Mattis used to to say you dress for radio, and that was true before we ever had cameras in the studio. I've had some others say, I think you look pretty good in a turtleneck, but, weren't really sure how warm it was going to be in the studio today. And again, I'm hoping that Doug, who's going to spend the night in my office on the couch, isn't too cold, so we'll see if that works out for him. And anyway, that's kind of what we go through, but it relates only so well to one of the reasons why we have not been on the air until today, and that is, as you may have read somewhere, there's been quite a Texas power outage. The snow is one thing. My goodness, I've been to Alaska a number of times. I've backpacked and ridden horses through the Bob Marshall Wilderness. I've spent a significant amount of time in upstate New York and the Adirondacks, but it isn't so much the snow, it was the outage and not knowing if we had enough electricity to bring this broadcast to you. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Texas grid operator called ERCOT itself, ERCOT I should say, actually maybe overestimated its ability to maintain a reliable grid. Over the last couple of years, the reserve margin, that is the margin between the demand for electricity and the amount of electricity the grid can produce, has shrunk significantly. I won't go into all the details. Those of you that are interested, I do a Texas kind of broadcast the hour before I do this one. I went into it in probably so much detail that even people's eyes glazed over, but I went into it in some detail to say that part of the problem is that there was a focus on less reliable energy. Reliable energy is things like gas and coal, even nuclear power. Less reliable energy would be like wind turbines, like the ones out there in West Texas that are frozen solid right now, and solar and some of that. And so as a result, when wind and solar production dropped, which you might imagine does happen even in the winter, you need to have these gas and coal-fired plants trip on. And in some cases, they did not trip on because some of them, first of all, take a while to bring online. There are some which are kind of fast trip ones, but those in particular aren't as frequent and aren't as large. So that's one of the issues. The other is, quite frankly, it just got so cold that before it was all through, you had a situation where some of these natural gas plants out there in Permian Basin were just having the lines freezing up and the pipes freezing up, or the trucks not delivering some of the supplies necessary. So as a result, you went very quickly from having a margin to no margin. So it is true that some of this has to do with the fact that there was such an emphasis on what are called renewable sources. But if you look at, for example, I was looking at wind capacity, usually it's nearly 32,000 megawatts. It was less than 10%, so about 3,000 megawatts. And at one point it was at like 3%. For a while, you were only getting a less than 1,000. The solar panels were generating about 5,700 megawatts, but that's not enough to make up the difference. So a lot of people, including myself and I guess everybody around the table here, actually ended up with some of those outages. And this all comes at a time, which we'll probably talk about more tomorrow, when Bill Gates has a new book out, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And he was on 60 Minutes the other day with Anderson Cooper talking about what it would take and why we need to bring the American energy sector down to zero carbon emissions by 2050. To put that in perspective, and Dr. Merrill Matthews has become quite an energy expert, we'll ask him tomorrow, Americans use about 20 million barrels of petroleum products every day. I do not see how you're going to get those down. Now, to be fair, Bill Gates admits that as a guy that lives in a 66,000 square foot home and has a private jet company and a number of other things, probably isn't the best person to be talking about this. But nevertheless, we will probably get into much more of that tomorrow. But this whole issue, if you will, of a climate hysteria and a climate crisis is kind of front and center of the Biden administration, and it was interesting to have the book come out at a time when so many people were sitting around in the dark without power, for example, in the state of Texas. But just before we wind down this hour, we'll spend some more time next hour, or maybe the next day, talking about Rush Limbaugh. But I did want to acknowledge that he died, and that his voice, which has been such a prominent voice in radio, is gone. And I was struck by, as I went back and did some of the research, how some of it paralleled, if you will, the history of Point of View. As you may not know, Point of View has been on the air almost 50 years. And I was unaware of the fact that I knew Rush Limbaugh started his career back in the late 1980s, first in Sacramento and eventually went on WABC in 1988. But I did not know that Rush Limbaugh tried to be a disc jockey on an AM station back in 1971. So just as Marlon Maddox was beginning his local program, which today we call Point of View, at about the same time, Rush Limbaugh was trying, as an opinionated kind of young man at that point, trying to get some of his ideas out, but he sooner or later, I'm sure sooner, I don't know the whole history, they ran afoul of the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine was one that really prevented a lot of in-depth conversation sometimes. But eventually, by the 1980s, the Fairness Doctrine simply went away. At that time, Marlon Maddox then put this radio program up on satellite, and it became a national program. And when the Fairness Doctrine was ended in 1987, matter of fact, I started being a guest host in 1986, then Rush Limbaugh started on a national program out of WABC in 1988. And I thought it was just kind of interesting to see some of the parallel there as well, because so many people have been talking about Rush Limbaugh being on for, 30 years, and that's impressive. I've been doing this program since 1986, either as a guest host, a co-host, or a host. So that's a few years there as well. But again, when you think of Point of View being around almost 50 years, very significant. And at the same time, people trying to challenge him. We'll talk tomorrow with Dr. Merrill Matthews. He has kind of an inside story a little bit about Jim Hightower, one of the first to try to develop a liberal alternative to Rush Limbaugh, which didn't work. Mario Cuomo, we already mentioned Andrew Cuomo. Mario Cuomo is the father of Andrew Cuomo, and the former governor of New York, tried to do a national show to contradict and counter Rush Limbaugh. That one didn't work out. And, of course, for those of you in Minnesota might remember Al Franken, Air America in 2004. That one didn't work out so well. And if nothing else, the sad part about all of this is whenever an individual that's a conservative dies, the mean-spirited statements and comments that are being made on Twitter are really over the top. But nevertheless, we'll maybe have a little bit more of a statement about the impact of talk radio, the impact of Rush Limbaugh, and maybe some of the reminiscence tomorrow. But we need to take a break and encourage you to find some of the articles we've posted here today, because they really give you that opportunity to read those, including one which is entitled A Voice Like No Other, giving you just a little bit of the history of Rush Limbaugh and some of the impact that he has made. I think it's fair to say that since the passing of Ronald Reagan, one of the more prominent, if not the most prominent conservative voice, oftentimes was Rush Limbaugh. Let's take a break. We're going to talk with our friend Chuck Bentley about 7 Gray Swans right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend Chuck Bentley about the subject that is part of his book that you can get on Kindle, 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future. It is amazing because I write these commentaries ahead of time. Don't know they're always going to land on the same day, but my commentary today is about socialism. That is one of those trends of concern. And if you're not familiar, this whole booklet that I've put together on socialism and the previous booklet on capitalism and socialism are available to you. The one on capitalism and socialism kind of gives you an overview of the two subjects and then talks about some of the critiques and criticisms that socialists and others have of capitalism. Then it occurred to me I really need to write this booklet on socialism, which then comes back and looks at socialism in particular and looks at all the arguments for socialism and gives some answers to that. So those are some things that we've made available for some time. My commentary today on socialism is due to the fact that we did an interview fairly recently with George Barna at the Cultural Research Center, and his post-election survey was encouraging, at least to me, in which he has found that even though socialism is still, sadly, very popular among young people compared to capitalism, the interest and the support for it has dropped significantly for various groups, especially among Americans aged 30 to 49, which is probably the group that we've seen the greatest drop. Those were those individuals that, say, 10 years ago and even 15 years ago, we were saying we're much more likely to support socialism than capitalism. But even for those over the age of 50, some of the interest in socialism has dropped. So that has been an encouragement. And so I wanted you to see that commentary that is there. Also those booklets, and most importantly, let's, if we can, now bring our good friend Chuck Bentley onto the program, CEO of Crown Financial Ministries, the largest Christian financial ministry in the world, founded by the late Larry Burkett, and an individual that has really educated all of us through his books, through his radio broadcast, My Money Life, and through this latest resource, 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future. So, Chuck, it is always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, I can't wait to jump into this with you today. I hope we've got a good connection, but I have a question of my own before we jump into my book. How are you and the team pulling this off during Snowmageddon?
Yes, and we have not been doing a live show till today. It has been only because, really, of the blackouts and the outages that have kept us from that. I have no problem tromping through the snow or driving in the snow, but we have been able to have a consistent set of power. And as a matter of fact, you did not hear, but last hour, my engineer, Doug's going to actually sleep in my office overnight, not even leave the building. So we are doing fine. You're being heard nationwide. And if nothing else, a good example of why we need to be resilient in the midst of some of these financial challenges. And wouldn't you agree that we have faced probably more financial challenges because first of the pandemic, the lockdown, and then some of these other issues that people are now going to be hearing about in your book?
Well, no doubt about it, but I just want to say bravo, Kerby, to you and Steve, to the whole production team at Point of View. Well done. I know the circumstances are tenuous at best with rolling outages, pipes breaking. I've had friends posting pictures of icicles hanging off of their ceiling fan inside of their home in Texas. So I really appreciate the effort you guys have made. But you're exactly right, Kerby. We are in for more financial turbulence. No doubt about it. It is underway right now. We're seeing very significant policy shifts. We're seeing the development of some of these gray swans that I thought may be way off into the future. In my opinion, some of them are developing rapidly before our very eyes.
Let me just mention that one of the things I appreciate about you, and I think you and I both try to be positive, even in the midst of some negative circumstances, your publicist advised you to avoid fear-mongering, and I know you've taken that to heart. But at the same time, we need to have prudence, and the scriptures say that a prudent man foresees danger and takes precautions. A simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. So we have always been trying to be on the wall, being the watchman on the wall, to alert people to potential dangers. And that's really the reason why you put this Kindle book together, because in a very short order, anybody can download this and read it and recognize that we've been through a financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. We're kind of facing another one. But as we look ahead, there are some danger points that we need to pay attention to, right?
Kerby, it reminds me of what happens when you and I are on an airplane and the pilot comes on the air and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts," because turbulence is ahead. And the first reaction is, "Oh, no, I don't want to hear about the turbulence." But you're very, very glad someone said, "Put your seatbelt on, and we're going to do our best to navigate around this." And internally, you're more prepared for that bumpy ride than if the pilot didn't say anything to you. And so I'm not trying to fear-monger. I'm not a doom and gloomer by any stretch of the imagination. But it's pretty easy to see that these gray swans are on the horizon. I think anybody can recognize them. I don't have some special ability. I just happen to have a habit, almost a compulsion to track them and to keep up with them, and then to share them with others so that they can put their seatbelt on too.
And again, we'll encourage people after the break to number from 1 to 7. We'll try to cover all 7, but make the distinction, first of all, what a gray swan is, but the difference between a gray swan and a black swan, and whether this last year is qualifying as either a black swan or a gray swan. What's your thoughts?
Well, the best-selling book, The Black Swan, was written about an economic event that is totally unpredictable and quite devastating, something that could never be in your financial plan. There's literally nothing you can do about it. As a derivative of that thought, economists began to identify what they thought were gray swans, which is a different nature. Those are things you can identify in advance, but they have a low probability of occurring, so we tend to ignore them. When I look back at what we've just been through in, say, the past 10, 11, 12 months, I would say that COVID-19, the pandemic, is a gray swan. We knew that in history, pandemics happen. We knew there was a possibility it would happen. We just ignored it and never thought it would happen here. Now, I would say that the government's response to the pandemic, shutting down almost this draconian grip over the economy, shutting down all non-essential businesses, I consider that a black swan. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody thought we wouldn't be traveling, flying, moving about to the extent that we have. And that one is more of a black swan in my view.
Chuck Bentley with us, and when we come back, we'll talk about these very important series of issues that you need to pay attention to. And again, a key verse also would be 1 Chronicles 12:32, where it talks about the sons of Issachar were men who understood the times and knew what they should do and knew what Israel should do. And likewise, we need to be like that as well. So we're going to talk about things like universal basic income, digital currency, even this idea of modern monetary theory, socialism, social scoring, fragile networks, biometric identification. We're going to get into each one of those. You might number from 1 to 7. We'll cover all 7 if we can. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Numerous surveys show that socialism is often more popular among young people than capitalism. That's why I've written numerous commentaries and booklets on the subject. My booklet on a biblical view on capitalism and socialism explains the two views and answers many of the criticisms socialists have about the free enterprise system. My booklet on a biblical view on socialism helps to answer many of the arguments used to promote socialism. The latest post-election survey done by the Cultural Research Center shows a significant decline in support for socialism. George Barna believes that another reason for this decline is the aggressive marketing of a government-driven culture that show young and old what socialism in America would really be like. He found that the most precipitous decline in support for socialism was among Americans aged 30 to 49. Just a decade ago, they were the demographic I often pointed to as those who supported socialism more than capitalism. That has changed significantly. Socialism is less popular even for Americans who are age 50 years or older. In the past, they have been the group most consistent in their support of capitalism. But even in this group, there is an 8 percentage point drop in support for socialism. The demographic groups with the least support for socialism were Christians who had a biblical worldview and what George Barna calls sage cons. That would be spiritually active, governance-engaged conservative Christians. But there's still a small percentage of them who support socialism. That is why I have a section in my booklets on whether the Bible teaches socialism. You know, support for socialism is declining, and that is good news. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
As I mentioned just a minute ago, the prudent man, or woman, actually foresees danger and takes precautions. That's Proverbs 27:12. And we're going to look at 7 trends that threaten our financial future. And again, we're not trying to do fear-mongering, but helping you prepare to understand your times with knowledge of what you need to do. And again, you might number from 1 to 7. And Chuck Bentley with us, and we have information about not only crown.org, which is his website, but also the 7 Gray Swans, a very inexpensive Kindle book that you can actually download and start reading even as we go through this. The first one, Chuck, is this whole idea of universal basic income, UBI, the promise and peril of universal basic income. This is something that has really been identified by a lot of individuals, and so as a result is something we should pay attention to. It's not just something that you hear from Andrew Yang, but all sorts of other people that are in positions of influence are quoting it. So what about this idea of universal basic income?
Well, Kerby, it goes all the way back to Martin Luther King Jr., who I deeply admire, but he was an early proponent of universal basic income. And the idea is that the government pays a regular income to everyone without any conditions, that there are literally no qualifying achievements or filters in order to receive this monthly income. Andrew Yang called his the freedom dividend, and he thought everyone should receive $1,000 a month. And I've got a lot of serious problems with it. I think that obviously there's a promise to it that people who think that it sounds good believe it's going to resolve inequality. It'll close the wealth gap in our country. That's a lot of concern for many people, especially young people right now. It also eliminates humiliating welfare programs. So if it's called a freedom dividend, it has a better marketing tone to it. And then it also is hopefully an opportunity to avoid austerity so that we would never have to find ourselves in a tightening of the belt or the government, so that people are circulating enough money to keep the economy growing. So that's the promise of it. But as you know, Kerby, we have to start with the very question, how do we pay for it? How do you send everybody $1,000 a month? And I believe it's similar to saying the government's going to host a lottery, everyone is going to win, and we will divide the pot equitably among the winners. And everybody gets to win, but you don't even have to buy a ticket. So there's no income associated with the program whatsoever. It truly is a pie-in-the-sky idea.
And again, if we want to also focus on the fact that as a Christian ministry, this also seems to violate some basic tenets of the idea of work, the value of work, of responsibility, of accountability. Those who will not work will not eat is a New Testament phrase. It doesn't say those who cannot work will not eat. We certainly want to reach out to those who are face some kind of persecution, misfortune, whatever it might be. I think that can happen primarily through church and civic organizations. But by telling everybody they're going to get paid and they don't have to work for it, I don't think that works very well just from a biblical point of view. What's your thoughts?
Absolutely, Kerby. Certainly not from a biblical point of view, but even if you just look at it through an economic lens, you're going to create a non-productive population. And I think that's a dystopian worldview that man is simply a consumer, and they can be satisfied if we put a little money in their pocket and tell them to go shopping. Reality is God created us to work. We are creative, innovative producers. We need people to be adding to the goods and services in the economy. So we never want to create a non-productive population. We also don't want to add more inefficiency to an already bloated government, nor empower the government over a source of our income, creating more and more people who are dependent on the government, and therefore, I think, at a great risk of losing their economic freedom.
Let's, if we can, get to the next one, digital currency and an electronic economy. This is something, Chuck, we've talked about before, sometimes when we've done programs on prophecy about a future cashless society. But there are all sorts of issues to look at, even before we get into the prophetic issues of that. But what about this idea? Because some people might think, well, digital currency, that makes some sense. Now, again, that we're not talking about cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or something like that. We're talking about a digital currency. What are some of the concerns you have there?
Well, I did an informal survey on my Facebook page. I have quite a few followers on Facebook, and I asked them if they thought that we would be cashless, 100% cashless in 10 years. The split on the vote was 50-50. 50 said that we would not be ever, and the other 50% said yes, within 10 years there will not be any currency in circulation in our economy. And it trended towards the younger people who not only think it will happen, they're hoping that it will happen. They don't like cash. They are all electronic at this point. Everything is done through the phone, done through the laptop. And so they're not thinking about what I consider the disadvantages of it. Obviously, there's a prophetic concern every time I hear the thought that all currency will, physical currency, bullion, and printed dollars will go away. I start thinking about privacy. I don't want to be in a situation where every single transaction that I make is scrutinized by someone else or at risk of being blocked, where someone could say, no, you can't make that transaction. We don't approve of that transaction. So I think privacy is a big concern. I also think that we need to be concerned about simply maintaining our freedom. Cash gives us freedom, and fortunately, right now, according to a Harvard survey last year, 30% of all transactions in the United States are still conducted with hard currency.
So again, a good illustration of that. By the way, I have a booklet on privacy and surveillance, and that in just a few minutes is going to surface when we talk about some of the other things that are happening in other countries. But again, this you've looked at this internationally, and some arguments that are being pushed for, especially this idea of the Great Reset, are saying, look, you had a cash crisis in India. There has been a push even in China to go into a digital currency and those kinds of things. So in some respects, this is one that is really heading down the road pretty quickly, isn't it?
I think so, Kerby. I think it's got widely popular support, especially during COVID, when people are saying that cash is dirty and it's likely to spread the virus. You're also seeing people say that our digital wallets are going to be more secure in the future, less likely that you will get robbed, less likely that anything will ever be stolen from you. So they're making a real big push for it. And obviously, any type of dictatorial government would be in favor of it. They would love it. They want to have absolute control over the currency. And I want to bring this one to people's attentions, not just for the future, which I think it will involve prophetically, the loss of the freedom and privacy of using cash, but also because I think it's very important for us to be able to have discretion over where our money is going right now. We can support ministries. People can support Point of View. People can get involved with spreading the gospel and bringing truth to the world without anybody deplatforming us. Can you imagine if you were banking somewhere and they said, if you're supporting one of those organizations that we've deemed a hate group or, crazy radical group, you're not able to transfer your funds there. That would be a terrible day for I think, the people of faith.
I would certainly agree. Let's take a break. And again, we're talking about this book, 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future. And if you'd like to download it, very inexpensive. And it looks at two that we've already covered, universal basic income and this idea of a digital currency and electronic economy. When we come back, we're going to talk about this idea of modern monetary theory. That sounds real heavy, but it's pretty simple. Socialism, of course, which we have talked about many times before. The idea of social scoring, which is happening right now in China, but illustrates again the dangers of a digital currency, biometric identification, and even the idea of fragile networks. Some of these all come together in a very significant way, and we are using this so that you might be aware of some of the things that are happening in our society and to make appropriate plans, and also just to consider who you might vote for in future elections. But as the time goes on, I think it's really important for us to be prudent. Prudent people make wise decisions, and that's, again, a paraphrase of Proverbs 27:12, and that's why we're covering some of those today. We've covered 2 of the 7. We'll cover the other 5 after the break, and if you would like to know a little bit more, go to our website, pointofview.net, or you can go right directly to Crown Financial Ministries. Either way, we're going to take a break, and we will continue our conversation right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Chuck Bentley, who is, again, the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. Perhaps you hear his radio broadcast, My Money Life. We have all sorts of information about him and also this booklet that we are working our way through, 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future. And, Chuck, in order to get through all of them, let's keep moving because one of the chapters deals with modern monetary theory. Now, that's a big word, but anybody that's ever taken a class in the public schools or certainly in the universities have heard about this, but even if you have never heard the phrase before, you recognize that this idea that we can just keep spending and we can spend our way out of a financial crisis and all of the rest, and we can send these various COVID payments ad infinitum without any impact, I think are all, in a sense, coming back to this idea of modern monetary theory, aren't they?
Yes, they are, and I think it's a Gray Swan that's absolutely upon us right now, Kerby, because it sounds like this crazy, unorthodox idea that would never work and that no one would ever believe it. But my thesis is that we're actually practicing it now. So I want to explain what it means, and I think most people will agree with me that it is underway. It's unflatteringly referred to as the magic money theory or the monopoly money theory.
Yes.
It's been put forward by Dr. Stephanie Kelton, who's a noted economic professor. She wrote a book about it called The Deficit Myth, and her premise is that any government that issues its own currency operates like the bank in the game of monopoly, and the deficits that they create do not matter, and that they can print as much money as they like to keep the game going. And you think about that, it's a complete unorthodox view of the historic principles that have built a strong economy or a strong nation. And you think, well, that would be crazy if we ever did that because we would just print money until we created a crisis for ourselves. And my contention is that modern monetary theory is being practiced today. When you hear candidates talk about printing money or even these stimulus checks you referenced, they're not asking should we do it, but just who gets it. The amounts are truly unsustainable, but they just continue to happen, and they just keep on coming, Kerby.
Well, again, this is what's called fiat money, and it only works as long as people have confidence in it. You have worked quite a bit in Zimbabwe. Should I hold up my $10 trillion or $100 trillion Zimbabwe notes? I've got them in my desk, but I think anybody that's watched this program has seen those before. And you have seen only so well, having worked on the board of the Foundations for Farming there in Zimbabwe, what happens when you inflate the currency and it isn't worth anything.
Well, I actually own the $100 trillion version, the largest currency ever printed in the history of mankind, and that was after they dropped, I think, 3 or 6 zeros before they printed that one. And that kind of currency would blow on the ground. I literally picked some of it up in my travels there because toilet paper was worth more than the currency.
Wow.
And that can happen. And as you pointed out, Kerby, a fiat currency is only as good as the confidence that people place in it. And when there is profligate spending, when there's out-of-control printing, at some point, and we don't know what point that will be, people will say, I don't think it's worth anything anymore. I like to point to Venezuela. They went from a strong economy. They adopted socialistic principles. They started printing more money than they could actually sustain with the assets of the country. And today, they have what is called the Venezuelan Bolivar millionaires. Every person receives about 82,000 Bolivar per month, making them annually receiving in excess of $1 million of income. The problem is, I think it works out to about $7,000 a year in U.S. dollars. So it's just been completely destroyed. It's devalued, and nobody wants paid in Bolivars anymore. That's what I'm concerned about happening here under MMT.
Well, and again, let's be fair and point out, as you do there, that when you look at the ratio of debt to GDP, whether it's Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, or now, of course, Joe Biden, that debt to GDP goes higher and higher. And I remember when Ronald Reagan was in office and your predecessor, Larry Burkett, was talking about the coming economic earthquake, because at that time we were concerned about the fact that we had a $1 trillion debt running towards $2 trillion. I think maybe Larry Burkett was right. He was just off by a few decades, because you can see what happens when you're spending more money than your GDP. And so this has been happening under Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, under Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses, hasn't it?
Well, that's why I say that it's not just theory. This Gray Swan is happening before our very eyes. It is in full play right now. And I think we have to look to Japan as the model that I believe we're following. Japan is nearing a 300% debt to GDP ratio.
Wow.
They've been in stagflation for decades. And that looks like to me where we're headed. That doesn't mean we're going into a collapse. It doesn't mean a collapse is imminent. Right now, there are no formidable competitors to replace the dollar as a global reserve currency. I don't think that as much as China or Russia wants to do it, that they're going to convince the world to place trust in their currency. At least I hope not. I hope not that we will not place our trust in their currency. As long as we're the reserve currency of the world, we're going to stretch this out for a while, Kerby.
Wow. Let's move on to democratic socialism. Again, it's a topic we've addressed quite often here, but again, you spent some time talking about how, again, the younger you are, the more likely you are to adopt socialism, although I do give you some indication even today with my commentary that maybe things are turning a little bit. And you also address this issue that I hear from some of our well-meaning Christian friends. Well, you know, really, if you think about it, Jesus was kind of a socialist, and the Bible teaches and supports socialism, but you take on that particular argument, don't you?
Well, I like to tell people I have thought about it. It's not like I just woke up with a strong opinion. I've not only thought about it, I've studied it. I've paid attention when I was traveling to socialistic or communistic countries of the world, and I've done my homework on this issue. Number one, Jesus was not a socialist. And number two, this idea that freedom, or let's just say free markets, Kerby. The idea that free markets equals greed is a myth. Free markets do not equal greed. Greed resides within an individual's heart. And free markets are necessary for an economy to grow and for individuals to flourish and to improve their lives. So I want to defend capitalism. I want to defend free markets. And I want to do it from a biblical standpoint, because you and I both know, and Kerby, I'm confident, and you know more about it than I do, that this country was founded on the idea of capitalism because we wanted our people to be free, but it was also assumed that we would have a strong moral basis for managing the fruit of our labor, for taking care of one another through the private sector. And that was the intention when this country was founded. And when our moral values erode, when our heart becomes corrupted by money, then you see some of the great disparity happening now. And I think the young people are crying out for a solution. I'm just trying to tell them socialism is the wrong solution.
And again, there's some great resources that we've made available here. PragerU's done a lot of videos. But back to the point you make is that a very high percentage of people that are in the millennial generation, and we do discuss that because we have a millennial roundtable from time to time, said that they would likely vote for a socialist candidate. And some of that gets back to some of the statements being made about free college and equality and all the rest. But those are some issues that obviously need to be addressed. But let's take a break. We come back, we'll put two together, social scoring and biometric ID. Those are all in the same chapter, so those will be two that kind of fit together very easily. And then the last one about fragile networks, insecurity in an interconnected world. And just again gets us back in the fact that we all benefit from the internet. We all benefit from the idea that we can go online and order things and all the other issues, but at the same time recognizing the amount of power that sometimes is ceded to those individuals who control social networks, who control financial institutions. One of the reasons why we do raise some very good questions about the idea of a cashless society, and one of the reasons that we need to pay attention. So if you're taking some notes, first one, of course, was universal basic income. The second one was the idea of digital currency. The third was modern monetary theory. The fourth, democratic socialism, and then we'll get into social scoring, biometric identification, and fragile networks. All part of this book, 7 Gray Swans, Trends That Threaten Our Financial Future, written by Chuck Bentley, who is the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. We'll continue our conversation with him right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the book 7 Gray Swans with Chuck Bentley. The two that kind of come together in the same chapter, social scoring and biometric ID. But social scoring and social credit ratings are things we've seen in China. And people say, well, that's not going to come to this country. Oh, yeah? How about if you are maybe going to an Airbnb, they can actually disable your account for life for any reason, and there's really no appeal. If you don't get a good rating as a driver or passenger, you could be eliminated from their service. There are people in financial institutions using their corporate power to prevent individuals from using various kinds of financial services. In some respects, this connects back to the comments you made about this idea of a cashless society, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, Kerby. And if you look at what's happening in China, they have married together this idea of a biometric ID and social scoring. So biometric ID means that they have some part of your biology to track your identity. So that's usually a fingerprint, an iris print, or in some cases, facial recognition software. And they've created a database in China that puts that biometric ID with what they're calling a social credit score. And it sounded innocent enough. By the way, their principle in China is this: once untrustworthy, always restricted. So if you do anything they deem bad, wrong, like criticize the government, then you will always be restricted without appeal. You will have your social credit score lowered, which means it will affect how much money you can borrow, whether you can travel, whether you can get a tax refund, whether you can get government benefits, whether you can visit a building, a government office. So they're taking draconian control or Orwellian control over their entire economy. And what's happened is it's devolved into worse than anybody ever thought. Now, if you're driving bad, if you get too many speeding tickets, your social score goes down. If your dog is barking, keeping up neighbors in the apartment complex, your social score goes down. And so they're just absolutely controlling everything they can. And what I see is the dangerous possibility that what's happening in the private sector here could roll into the public sector, where someone gets the idea, hey, we need those social scores here to keep terrorists off of airplanes. And it will start with something that seems convenient, something that seems helpful, and before you know it, it will devolve into absolute control over our finances, over our freedoms.
And again, that's one of the reasons why we've written about privacy and surveillance, because of the concern that some of that can actually devolve into very quickly. But just so that we finish all seven, those were kind of 5 and 6. Number 7 then would be fragile networks, insecurity in an interconnected world. And this one is of concern because the number of cyber attacks are increasing. So that makes us wonder whether or not any of our finances are secure. But it's much more than that. A cyber attack can actually shut down of energy production, which we've been talking about even here in the state of Texas. It can actually close down factories. It can make it so that gas stations aren't able to pump fuel, that airline travel will be halted. There is a very significant concern about the fact that a lot of our daily life is in one way or another connected to these fragile networks, and that's another concern that you have, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And I really, we're looking at it through a dual lens. When I talked about fragile networks, I certainly was referring to the issue of reliability. Are the networks that we're depending on reliable? Can they be interrupted? For instance, Tesla had a complete outage of their system where people could not get into their own vehicle and drive. Imagine if that was the day your wife went into delivery and you were planning on taking her to the hospital in your maybe your only car. Those things are very, very concerning. They happen more often because I started to categorize some of these in the various sectors where they happen, whether it's mobile phones or electric grid, or even automobiles now. But the other fragility that I wanted to point out is the fragility of our security. One contract that we all sign without reading over and over and over are these contracts with software providers. We say, I agree, don't bother me, I don't want to read it, it's 50 pages long and it's got too many fine details in it. And we are turning over the trust of our sometimes very, very private information to a third party. And we're assuming they're the good guys and that it will always be secure there. But I think that's a very bad assumption, and one that I'm trying to help people to understand. Just because you say you've stored it in the cloud doesn't mean that someone else might not have access to that information.
And we certainly have found that to be the case. So, of course, you have all sorts of practical things. Avoid phishing attempts and rethink, where you store your information, how you store your information, how digitized you become, and all the rest. But for the last few minutes, let's see if we can talk about the fact that they can go to crown.org and get an ebook there. We also have a link there as well. But as they go there, they can find out a lot more about how to manage their money, how maybe to reevaluate their career, and how to learn all sorts of great resources from those of you that have been thinking about this for some time. So they can read those resources, they can listen to those resources, and they can use those to help them plan a budget, to begin to plot their way through this 21st century challenge that we're all facing, and most importantly, find out how to get a copy of 7 Gray Swans. So talk about what's available on your website.
Well, what we want to do is help people increase their capacity to weather storms. In the parable of the storms, the Lord said that both of them get a storm. One storm hits those whose house is built on sand and the other on the rock. And we want to be sure that those that we're helping, those people of faith who want to do it God's way, knows how to increase their capacity to get through any of these gray swans, which essentially means you've built your house, your economic house, on the rock, on the foundation of Christ and his principles. But we've made so many things available for free at crown.org. I also would mention, Kerby, I love the promo of your program right now, that one way people can help Point of View is to spread the word through social media. Provide reviews at Amazon if you've got materials there. Share it on Facebook or Instagram or other places. We can use these platforms for spreading salt and light right now. And I think it's a very good strategy. I would encourage your listeners and supporters to get behind Point of View, because you're doing so much good to even address these gray swans, I think, more in depth than I've been able to.
Well, again, we always appreciate Chuck Bentley. He's a good friend and a supporter of Point of View. Of course, my wife and I have certainly over the years supported Crown Financial and appreciate the good work that they do there as well. So, as always, we appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Keep up the good work and stay warm over there.
Yeah. We'll see if we can keep the lights on, keep the power working, and we'll do that. Just before we run out of time, let me mention some of the resources we have posted on the website. Last hour, you might have heard the interview we did with Mike Gonzalez about the difference between equity and equality. And if you didn't have a chance to hear that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. We did have just one article about Rush Limbaugh, A Voice Like No Other, which you can read. And, of course, we'll have a little bit more to say about that tomorrow. Also, a piece, we didn't have a vaccine when we took office. That came from Joe Biden. Just got a note from Kelly Shackelford, said we should talk about that on Friday. I said, okay, well, we'll do that. And then one of the other ones that we've posted, false claims about the Capitol riot from Glenn Greenwald. Those are just a few of the resources that we've posted there as well. And of course, a link to this book, 7 Gray Swans, because we are looking at a lot of these very important issues, and we wanted you to be aware and to act like a prudent Christian as you begin to evaluate what is happening in the future. First of all, I want to thank Doug for coming in today so that we could make this program possible. He'll be with us tomorrow as our engineer. Also want to thank Steve for producing all of this, and I hope that you stay warm, and I hope that you'll join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.